At its inception, the United States government was designed as a constitutional federal republic. You can think of it as a meticulously engineered machine. Instead of concentrating authority in the hands of a single monarch, the architects of this system drafted a series of overlapping safeguards, locking together to prevent the rise of a tyrant. The operating manual for that machine is the United States Constitution. Drafted in 1787, it established the rigid legal boundaries and the strict rules of engagement for how the nation would govern itself. This diagram maps out the core of that manual, the separation of powers doctrine. It splits the federal government into three distinct, co-equal branches. The legislative branch writes the laws, the executive branch enforces them, and the judicial branch interprets them. Each holds specific mechanisms to check or block the overreach of the other two. Beyond dividing power horizontally across branches, the blueprint divides it vertically through a concept called federalism. Sovereignty is shared across multiple levels. You have one overarching federal government, 50 individual state governments, and beneath them, over 89,000 local municipalities handling county and city laws. On paper, this structure guarantees a highly decentralized system. It forces compromise, diffuses authority across thousands of elected officials, and ultimately keeps the levers of power within reach of the voting public. But this data visualization reveals a stark reality. According to recent polling, 69% of Democrats and 69% of Republicans, voters who rarely agree on anything, both believe the nation's democracy is in danger of collapse. If the constitutional blueprint was perfectly designed to protect the republic, we have to ask why the machinery feels like it's breaking down. To understand the systemic strain, we need to look past the official text of the Constitution. We have to examine the hidden, unwritten mechanics that actually drive modern American politics. The Founding Fathers explicitly warned against political factions, fearing they would tear the new country apart. Yet almost immediately, the system was captured by a two-party duopoly that continues to this day. Look at this mathematical model of a first-past-the-post electoral system. In this format, the candidate with the most votes in a single district wins the seat entirely. The math inherently forces voters to consolidate their support behind the two largest, most viable parties to avoid splitting the vote and inadvertently electing their least favorite candidate. Driving this two-party system is an invisible layer of governance, special interest groups and political action committees, or PACs. PACs are independent organizations that pool financial contributions to aggressively campaign for or against specific political candidates. Many of them operate right here, out of the corporate offices on K Street in Washington, D.C. Modern elections require massive television and digital campaigns to win. To fund them, lawmakers rely on a federal lobbying industry that spent an astonishing $4.4 billion in a single election cycle to influence policy. When candidates depend on vast sums of money just to remain competitive, their legislative priorities naturally shift toward wealthy donor classes and corporate interests. Researchers characterize this outcome as a civil oligarchy, a system where a small economic elite dominates lawmaking, while average citizens have a near-zero statistical impact on public policy. This chart breaks down the demographic data of the general U.S. population and compares it directly against the current members of Congress. The people making the laws are overwhelmingly older, whiter, and more male than the citizens they govern. Women, Black, Latino, Native American, and LGBTQ+ citizens remain severely underrepresented across all levels of federal and state government relative to their actual population sizes. Furthermore, millions of U.S. citizens living in unincorporated territories like Puerto Rico and Guam, as well as residents of Washington, D.C., pay federal taxes and abide by federal laws, but have absolutely no voting representation in Congress. These gaps persist despite fierce historical battles to secure universal suffrage. In 1917, suffragists took to the streets by the thousands just to force the system to acknowledge their right to a ballot. But as the modern data shows, simply holding the legal right to vote does not guarantee equitable political power, nor does it ensure that a voter's lived experience will be reflected in government policy. We are currently in an era defined by a measurable disconnect between what the majority of the public wants and the laws the government actually passes. This map demonstrates gerrymandering, State legislatures intentionally redraw House district boundaries using packing and cracking techniques. They pack opposing voters into a single district to limit influence, and crack the rest across multiple districts, diluting voting power below a 50% threshold. Staying with this map, we see the population disparity in the U.S. Senate. Because every state gets 2 senators regardless of size, rural areas hold disproportionate power. Today, 50 senators can easily represent 40 million fewer Americans than the opposing 50. In the executive branch, the Electoral College allows candidates to secure the presidency by winning specific, highly contested states, even if they lose the national-wide popular vote, a scenario that has occurred in 2 of the last 4 presidencies. Combined, partisan gerrymandering, the Senate's small state bonus, and the Electoral College create a counter-majoritarian system. The mechanics legally and consistently allow a political minority to rule a political majority. These distortions fuel extreme, asymmetric political polarization. Politicians have largely abandoned long-standing institutional norms, refusing to compromise on legislation and turning lifetime judicial appointments to the Supreme Court into hyper-partisan brawls. The most dangerous consequence of this polarization is democratic backsliding, a documented decline in the quality of a country's democratic institutions. We are now seeing a growing movement of elected officials who simply refuse to accept legitimate electoral defeat. When politicians refuse to accept the systemic outcomes of the voting process, the strain on the machine becomes physical. That breaking point manifested directly as physical violence against the legislative branch itself on January 6, 2021. To stabilize the machinery, researchers and legal scholars are proposing major structural reforms. These include instituting strict congressional term limits, eliminating partisan gerrymandering, and restructuring the Supreme Court to balance its ideological output. The American constitutional blueprint is an incredible historical achievement, but it is ultimately just ink on paper. It cannot enforce itself. The machine only functions if an active, vigilant populace is willing to step in and restructure the mechanics when they begin to serve the few, rather than the many.